birthday. My father-in-law was discharged from the hospital. I expected my wife and her family to bring him home. Instead, every person on my wife's side suddenly had an excuse. They were too busy. They had work. They had plans. I drove more than 200 kilometers to pick him up myself. But the moment he sat inside my car, he looked at me with fear in his eyes and whispered one sentence that changed everything. He said, "Do not take me home. Drive straight to the lawyer's office." I had no idea that my father-in-law had discovered something his own family was desperately trying to hide. My name is Ethan Walker, and for 10 years, I believed my wife's family was simply complicated. They were not always warm toward me, but I tolerated them because I loved my wife Jessica. Her father, Richard, had always been different. He was quiet but observant, and whenever someone in the family needed help, he was usually the first person they called. A few weeks earlier, Richard had been hospitalized after suffering a serious health emergency. Jessica told me that her family would handle everything. I trusted her because I thought his children would naturally take care of their own father. Then came the morning of his discharge. Jessica received a phone call and suddenly became nervous. She told me her brothers could not pick him up. Her sister was supposedly stuck at work. Another relative had an emergency. Everyone had a reason. I asked Jessica who was going to get her father. She looked at me and said, "I do not know." That answer bothered me. I told her I would go. The hospital was more than 200 kilometers away. I drove for hours thinking about Richard sitting alone after everything he had been through. When I finally reached the hospital, he was waiting near the entrance with a small bag beside him. He looked exhausted, but when he saw me, his expression changed. He quickly got into my car and closed the door. I asked him if he was ready to go home. He stared through the windshield for several seconds. Then he leaned toward me and whispered, "Do not take me home." I thought he was confused because of the medication. Then he said, "Drive straight to my lawyer's office." I asked him what was happening. He told me that before his hospitalization, he had discovered that several financial documents had been changed without his permission. Money had been moved from an account he had created for his future medical expenses. Property papers had also been prepared behind his back. Richard believed someone in the family was trying to gain control of his remaining assets. While he was vulnerable, I could barely believe what I was hearing. Then he gave me one more piece of information. He said the person he trusted most was not the person I expected. At the lawyer's office, Richard handed over a folder. Inside were bank records, property documents, and copies of messages between family members. The lawyer looked through everything carefully. Then he looked at Richard and said, "You were right to come here before going home." Richard had already changed his legal documents. But there was another surprise. The house that everyone believed would eventually belong to Jessica and her siblings was not being divided among them. Richard had placed strict conditions on the property because he believed his children had become more interested in his money than his well-being. That explained why everyone suddenly claimed they were too busy. They were not too busy. They were waiting for someone else to bring Richard home, so they could control what happened next. When Jessica found out I had taken her father to the lawyer, she became furious. She demanded that I bring him home immediately. I told her Richard was an adult and he had made his own decision. Then Richard called her himself. He did not yell. He simply told her that the truth was now documented and that nobody could pressure him anymore. The family meeting that followed was one of the most uncomfortable nights of my life. One by one, the excuses disappeared. Richard asked each person where they had been when he needed them. Nobody had an answer. Then he turned to me. He said, "You drove 200 kilometers when everyone else had a reason not to come." I told him I did not do it for his money. He smiled and said, "I know." That sentence changed the way I saw everything, because Richard had not taken me to the lawyer to make me his heir. He took me there because he needed one person he could trust when his own family had stopped protecting him. Months later, Richard recovered enough to live independently again. His family relationships were never the same. Some apologized. Others disappeared completely. But Richard kept one promise. He told me that the day I drove 200 kilometers to pick him up was the day he realized loyalty was not about blood. It was about who shows up when there is nothing to gain. And I will never forget what he told me before we left the lawyer's office. He said a family member is not the person who asks what they will inherit. A family member is the person who asks if you are okay.